Australia is the greatest nation on earth, and at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Wonderful to be back for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. Today we'll be talking about the government's misinformation and disinformation laws, the so-called Made in Australia industry plan, and Tony's recent trip to Hungary and the situation in Eastern Europe. Tony, great to be back.
Dan, lovely to be with you.
Tony, we'll go in reverse order of that. We'll kick off with your trip to Europe recently, where you gave a keynote address that was widely covered to the Hungary CPAC conference, where you talked about the future of conservatism and the shifting dynamics of the centre-right. You had a great write-up in The Australian, a lot of comments on the article. To start off with, can you tell us about your trip there, what you learnt and what you were doing?
Well, it's interesting that Hungary under Viktor Orban has been a bit of a gathering place for conservatives, because Viktor Orban has been described as the upside of Trump without the downside. He's a very experienced politician. He's a tough-minded conservative. He's won election after election, has now been continuously in office for 14 years. He's very pro-family. He's very hostile to political correctness. He's been very staunchly opposed to a lot of these socially progressive European Union directives. And even though the EU has on occasions tried to coerce him, he's been very resistant and indeed successfully resistant to that. So while not everyone agrees with his position on Ukraine, and I certainly think it should be more robust, he has been a very effective conservative leader, and in an era when there have not been all that many effective conservative leaders, certainly effective conservative leaders that you can readily admire, I think he's been a bit of a model. So look, it was good to be there. What I was really trying to say to the CPAC audience is that so many of the policies which are pushed by both sides of politics, often enough, are really a war on the working class. I mean, very high immigration is a war on the working class because it depresses wages, it boosts housing costs, it clogs infrastructure, and very often the people who feel the worst of the social downsides of very high immigration, particularly when communities aren't well integrated, again, it's the working class. Then, of course, there's the emissions obsession and the policies put in place to deal with the so-called climate emergency. Again, a war on the working class, because what's it doing? It's putting power prices through the roof. And again, that's okay if you can afford it, if you can afford to buy a Tesla and so on. But if you can't, it's a huge problem. If you are absolutely in need of a ute to do your job, your car is going up and up and up in price because of subsidies, so that much richer people can afford their Teslas, indulge their Teslas. And it's also driving our industries offshore. When you think of the United States, what were the industries where working class people got paid extremely well? Things like motor manufacturing, steel making, shipbuilding. All of these vital industries have migrated offshore in very large measure, particularly to China. Same things happen in Britain. Something like it has happened here, although our manufacturing base was never as big. But right now, in the name of combating climate change, our coal industry is under threat, our gas industry is under threat. Down the track, our iron ore industry will be under threat. These are all industries where workers can earn $200,000 plus if they're prepared to have a go. Those sorts of jobs are disappearing. Why? Because of this misplaced emissions obsession. So I really wanted to make the point that sensible conservatives are in a position to take advantage of a very unhappy segment of the population, decent, patriotic people who have been badly let down by the parties of the left, who have largely gone to the green left and abandoned their traditional working class base. But not all of the parties of the right have been able to harness that. Boris Johnson was able to do it over Brexit.
Yep.
Trump was able to do it to a considerable extent. John Howard did it in earlier times with Howard's battlers and so on. And in different ways, Reagan and Thatcher were able to do it. But I'm afraid the current British government isn't able to do it. I don't think that we were always able to do it as successfully as we should have been here in Australia in more recent times. So, as I said, it was a clarion call to my fellow Liberal conservatives to be, if you like, patriotic, supportive of small business, and supportive of traditional values, because I think that is the way to harness an effective majority in the modern world.
Well, there's a lot there, Tony. One of the things that I found really interesting about your speech is, of course, you've forgotten in 2013, you were able to win a significant share of the working class vote, the Tony's tradies, and you went a long way to that sort of realignment. You were almost ahead of the curve. Brexit and Trump came in 2016, you were 2013. One of the interesting things here, you talk about economic pragmatism. I wouldn't mind just drilling into that just a little bit, because we sort of had the 70s and 80s and 90s, which was the era of free market reform, free trade, globalisation, deregulation, which were absolutely critical to setting up our nation for a better future. I feel that now things are a little bit different. Not that those principles should be disbanded, but I think the centre-right is in need of a renewed economic agenda for the future, which I think does involve immigration. It does involve some of those issues you mentioned, but just interested in when you talk about economic pragmatism, what you had in mind.
It certainly doesn't involve abandoning the free market, because the best engine of wealth creation by far is the market. But it means being a little bit more pragmatic about the market than we have sometimes been. For instance, in recent times, we've been better at practicing the free market abroad than at home. We've almost completely abolished tariffs, while at the same time having massive green tape and so on domestic industries. So I think a proper market approach today, sensible economics today, is to be less free market globally and more free market domestically, because I am confident that Australian businesses and Australian workers will do good things for each other if they are allowed to. I'm not confident that Chinese businesses, just to name one particular entity, are going to do the right thing by Australia in the same way that Australian businesses operating in a free market will. Just to give you one example, and I'm not suggesting that there's anything sinister here, but we're about to lose our biggest plastic manufacturer, Qenos, which was sold to the Chinese some years ago. Now, they're closing down because they reckon they can make more money by selling their land for housing than by continuing to make plastics, given competition from overseas and the high price of gas here in Australia, thanks to the green rules. Now, that's actually going to make us, as a side effect, more dependent upon China for something that is essential for a modern economy, namely plastics. Now, this is the sort of thing that's happening.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that we should abandon market principles. Of course we shouldn't. but we've got to be aware of all of the ramifications of the things that we're doing. And free trade with China has given us a lot of cheap products, but at the same time, it's also given us a deindustrialisation process, and Chinese ownership means that it's decisions made in Beijing rather than decisions made in Sydney and Melbourne that are critically determining the shape of our economy going forward.
Yeah, and I guess this goes into the next discussion point, which is to do with the government's policy to deal with this issue, which is their so-called Future Made in Australia policy program, which so far is basically billions of dollars in subsidies for the government's preferred industry, which is essentially renewable energy. Now, I don't fundamentally, and Jim Chalmers, Treasurer, wrote an article today in The Australian, I don't fundamentally disagree with his assessment that we need to build more things here and make more things here, but then it's overlaid with this green climate ideology,
which is making it harder for us to actually manufacture things here. I mean, quite possibly Qenos would not be closing down if it weren't for the green lawfare, which the government is doing nothing to stop, that's preventing us developing the new gas fields, which are obviously there, begging to be developed. Narrabri, Beetaloo, etc. They should all be urgently developed because whatever you ultimately think about climate and emissions, gas is certainly a much more emissions-friendly resource than coal if we really do have to reduce our emissions that fast, that quickly. So look, what the government is doing, it is madly throwing our money, taxpayers' money, at a whole lot of private businesses that frankly should be going to the market, to the banks, to the finance houses, to the venture capitalists for funding if they really need it, because the banks, the finance houses and the venture capitalists are much better at picking which of these things really are going to be profitable and sustainable for the long term. That's where these businesses should be going. But there are a lot of clever capitalists who think the government is going to be a much softer touch than the bank. And so we've seen just over the last couple of months, I think it was 800 odd million for a rare earths facility in the Northern Territory, a couple of $100 million for a silicon project or a graphite project, I think it was in South Australia. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen $1 billion for the manufacture of solar panels on the old Liddell power plant site. I think it was just the other day we saw $1 billion for a quantum computing project in Queensland. It's reported that there's going to be more billions for green hydrogen in the budget on top of the $2 billion for green hydrogen in last year's budget. And of course, there's a conga line of rent seekers out there saying that it's got to be double-digit billions this time round. I mean, this is just wrong. And it's not like they're keeping going industries that we know we need and we know we can do. So much of this is blue sky stuff. So much of it, green hydrogen in particular, is utterly unproven at scale. And we are abandoning the things that we have done well and we have done well out of in favour of things which are speculative at best, all being done effectively on borrowed money that the taxpayer is going to have to find somewhere. So I think Bob Hawke would be turning in his grave, frankly. I think there's quite a few things that this government's doing that would be causing Labor's greatest ever leader to be anxious. The government's weakness on Israel would be another thing that would greatly concern Bob Hawke, as well as this new protectionism. John Howard is quite right. This is utterly at odds with the kind of instincts that made the Hawke-Keating government the best Labor government we've ever had.
And things could get a lot worse, Tony. So as we look to the election in 9 to 12 months' time, who knows what will happen, but it looks like it could be a minority government with the Greens and the Teals or some combination thereof. Well, that's only going to encourage the worst instincts of this government, far from being a brake on these issues, whether it's to do with, HECS debt relief, which is multi-billions of dollars, whether it's to do with the subsidies, whether it's to do with the spending and so forth. So, we've commented before that this government is at least as radical, if not more than Whitlam, but that could be turbocharged next term of government if there is a minority government. You had a lot of experience that in 2010 to 2013. Mm-hmm. So just interested in your thoughts on perspective of how that might play out.
Well, look, if you can't vote for the coalition, please vote Labor rather than voting Green, because at least the, I suppose, objective of forming a government and the necessity of at least some pragmatism is a handbrake on the wilder elements of the Green left inside Labor. But the Green left outside Labor have no such discipline on them, and that's why, as I said, if you can't vote for the coalition, please, whatever you do, don't vote Green. And it grieves me when, from time to time, for very short-term reasons, the coalition sometimes preferences the Greens ahead of Labor. I think it's a very, very firm rule. Almost never to be departed from, to vote one for the best party and then number the ballot paper in order of merit, not in order of political calculation.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, and I think we'll be talking a lot more about how the election is shaping up as the year progresses. I'd like to turn to what's been a big issue, and it's going to be an ongoing issue, which has been the stabbing, really an attempted murder of Ma Murray Emmanuel in the western suburbs of Sydney. There's a lot of facets to this. The first I want to cover is the argument, if you like, between the government and with Twitter and Elon Musk. The government is saying, you've got to take this down, the video. Elon Musk is saying, I'm not taking it down. They're headed to the federal court because Elon is basically disobeying the orders of the federal government. To start with, I'm just interested in your perspective on, should the video be brought down or should it stay up on social media platforms?
What worries me about all of this is the double standards that we're seeing from those who are desperate to see this particular act of violence taken off the online world, but not all the other acts of violence which are there. Yep. I mean, there's any amount of violence that you can see online. Why is this particular bit of violence so problematic? It's hard to avoid the suspicion that the people behind this drive to get rid of the footage of the assault on Bishop Emmanuel are motivated by some kind of anxiety about Islamophobia. Now, sure, let's avoid that. But just at the moment, that's the least of our worries, frankly. So that's problem number one. I do accept that the online world is a Wild West. It is an absolute Wild West. I think it does need to be tamed, but encouraging politically correct censorship by big tech, of which we already have a lot, by adding bureaucratic censorship, which is what the government's misinformation and disinformation legislation would do, and this whole Bishop Emmanuel footage thing seems to be a smokescreen for what is really an attempt to get their misinformation and disinformation bill back before the Parliament. I just think that's going to make a bad situation worse. We've always got to be careful about a knee-jerk reaction to a moral panic. And frankly, there has been a bit of a moral panic about this. And yes, there is a genuine difficulty, a real problem with the online world. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has recently highlighted the effect of living online on the mental health of young people. Over time, I think it's going to do dreadful things to our social evolution if it isn't adequately tackled. But the sorts of things I'd like to see government looking at are to make these platforms act like publishers. In other words, force them to take responsibility for the stuff that's posted, make them liable for the stuff that they post or host, in the same way that a newspaper or a television station is liable for the stuff that goes to air or goes to print. And the other thing I think we need to do is get away from this current ability for people to be anonymous online. Why should Fred the fireman from Forestville be able to post highly defamatory, grotesque, pornographic material and get away with it? Why should all these Islamist hate preachers be able to freely post their stuff online? I mean, we've all seen reams and reams of footage in the wake of October the 7th of Australian-based Islamist clerics inciting people to violence against Jews, against Christians. And why are we suddenly concerned with what looks like it might be a product of the hate speech, the online hate speech, rather than the hate speech itself? So, yes, there is an issue here, but I don't think the government's way of dealing with it is the right way to go.
Yeah, I share those views. I think to me, when you're talking about content online, I think you need a pretty clear demarcation of children and adults. I think target number one has to be how do we give parents the tools to make sure that children aren't exposed to things they shouldn't be exposed to. My view is it's just so difficult because at the moment, the approach of governments around the world is to try and police the content online. You're just not going to be able to, it's like you say, it's a Wild West. I don't know how you can deal with that, but what you can do is try and limit the access of children to the online world, which I think comes down to the regulation of their access to smartphones and that technology. I think that's where we need to go for children's protection, because that, to me, needs to be the number one issue. But do you have any thoughts in that context, Tony?
Well, and look, I'm very grateful that my kids grew up really prior to all this living online stuff. Again, Jonathan Haidt says that the mental health of teenagers, particularly teenage girls, really started to crash from about 2012 onwards, which was when people started getting really into the use of social media. So look, I'm grateful that I didn't have to deal with this in my own family, and I think of my young grandson and I wonder how him and his parents are going to go in all of this. My instinct is that, first of all, schools should absolutely ban all devices that are connected to the internet. If you're in class or in the playground, you should be learning your lesson or interacting with your fellows in the normal way. You shouldn't be staring at a phone or an iPad, mucking around on social media. And I am sure there are ways of restricting their access to things that are genuinely educational by using some kind of a educational intranet or something like that.
Yep.
So schools should ban connected devices. I really don't see why young kids need mobile phones. And if they have to have a mobile phone, let it be one that is simply a phone, not something that is connected to all these apps that you can use. And frankly, why do kids have to be on social media at least before they're 16? I mean, we really have to give kids the chance to grow up in a family and in a neighbourhood before they're exposed to this global jungle, this online Wild West. We really do. Now, it's parents' responsibility first and foremost to bring this about, but government can help. And quite apart from any attempt to civilise the online world, as I say, banning connected devices from schools during school hours is, to me, a no-brainer.
Oh, I agree. I don't see why you need phones in schools at all. Certainly, smartphones doesn't make sense to me.
Put them in a locker which is locked until 9 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. They go in a locker before the first bell goes. They go in a locker and they can't get it until the last bell goes at 3:30.
Well, there's a lot of schools that do ban that, and they do something like that. You got to go to the head office and drop your phone off, and then you pick it up on the way out, which is one way of managing it. Look, in terms of the other issue here that you mentioned, misinformation laws, what I found so galling about this whole issue is as you rightly say, the government is using this attempt. This was a terror event, as the New South Wales Police labelled it, that almost resulted in the murder of a bishop. They're using that, as you say, as a smokescreen for their misinformation laws. But the stabbing video has nothing to do with misinformation. It is a video of truth. It's what happened.
It is absolutely what happened. It's the unvarnished, horrible truth. An individual tried to kill a bishop because, according to this individual, the bishop had insulted the prophet. Well, we need to know, we do need to know that there are people out there who want to kill in the name of their conception of God, in the name of their religion. And again, this is where I really think that we need to hear more responsible voices inside the Muslim community saying that it is simply wrong to kill in the name of God. And any suggestion that Islam validates killing in the name of God is not true Islam, and it needs to be absolutely expunged. I mean, this is the point that President al-Sisi made back in 2014 and 2015. At the height of the Islamic State phenomenon, he said that for centuries we have been going down a false path in Islam with this whole death to the infidel thing. Now, it's not really up to me to try to explain what passages in the Quran are the ones to take seriously and what passages in the Quran are not the ones to take seriously. I just think it is the duty of decent, responsible Muslims to sift their scriptures so that this death to the infidel mindset is absolutely expunged.
Well, one of the concerning things was a statement made by one of the Muslim community leaders, or maybe more than one, that they weren't consulted before the subsequent raids. I mean, why would they be consulted? I mean,
exactly right.
That would not be a.
I dare say bishops haven't been consulted before raids on pedophile priests.
Nor should they be.
Nor should they be. And no one refuses to mention Catholicism when they're talking about pedophile priests. Why are we now squeamish about mentioning Islam when we're talking about terrorist attacks or terrorist attempts? So look, again, there can't be double standards here, and we've got to call things for what they are. And much as we might not want to upset people, and much as we do not want to tar a whole community with the crimes of a few, the fact is, if someone commits a terrorist offence crying Allahu Akbar, it's religiously motivated Islamist violence, and we have to call it for what it is.
Just to round out our discussion, Tony, and it sort of takes us back to the start with your speech in Hungary about the future of the centre-right. One of the things that the discussion about on the online world, the protection of children and things like that, reminds me of is that really from Menzies up until, I would say, roughly sort of 2000-ish, it was sort of the Liberal Party in Australia that was the party of social reform, whether it was expanding education opportunities, social welfare. I don't agree with all of its manifestations, but there was this idea of helping families, helping children for social betterment. in recent times, that's sort of become conflated with progressivism and identity politics. And I think the centre-right has been in retreat on the social front. One of the great things I think Peter Dutton has done is called for a ban on gambling advertising during sporting events, because that should be about sport and family time, not about gambling, which I think is a very sensible call. It strikes me that this online issue and the challenges that families are having with children is an opportunity for the Liberal Party, I think, to rekindle its history of social reform to help the family. You did that with your paid parental leave proposal, was an example in that lineage. So just to close off, we talked about the economic side, just interested in your thoughts on the social side.
Well, I think that the battle inside the centre-right is not between conservatism and liberalism. It's between conservatism and progressivism. I think that properly understood, liberalism and conservatism go well together, because properly understood, liberalism is not libertarianism. It really isn't. Real freedom can only exist within a structure of law and within an ordered and civilised community. And this is why freedom is a very, very important value. And without freedom, we cannot be fully human, but freedom needs to be tempered by discipline, it needs to be tempered by law, it needs to be tempered by respect. And the example you just gave of not having gambling ads on TV during sporting matches. I mean, I don't see that as some kind of authoritarianism or illiberalism. I see that as just a common sense application of a degree of restraint to what should otherwise be a place of freedom.
Well, Tony, I think that's a great note to end on. So really appreciate your time. I know you just got in yesterday from another overseas trip. So thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
We will indeed.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.